You always hear about the best ways to play each Sonic game, but that's boring. What about the worst ways to play each Sonic game? Sonic the Hedgehog is a series that spanned across multiple decades and platforms and has more remakes, ports, and re-releases than most people can keep track of. And while we've had our fair share of good Sonic games, the road hasn't been entirely smooth. Whether it's classic titles being poorly ported, modern games getting crammed onto underpowered hardware, or just bizarre cursed versions I'd rather forget existed, the version of certain Sonic games you play can sometimes make or break the experience. Welcome to chaomix, and today we'll be going over the absolute worst ways to play every mainline Sonic game. We'll be going through mainline games only, so we aren't here all day. We also won't be going over games with exclusive singular releases like Secret Rings or Black Knight, since there's only one way to play them. So let's go over the worst way to play each mainline Sonic game. Like usual, we're starting at the very beginning with Sonic 1. Such a fun little game. How could you screw this up? Oh no. Sonic the Hedgehog for the Game Boy Advance, or Sonic the Hedgehog Genesis, has to be one of the worst official products Sonic Team has ever put out. This was a port of Sonic 1 released in 2006 as part of the series' 15th anniversary, which was supposed to be a celebration of Sonic's legacy. But instead of celebrating, Sega decided to throw sand in his eye and burn his house down apparently. Man, 2006 was not a good year for our favorite Blue Rat, was it? The GBA port of Sonic 1 is like a monkey's paw effect. Like, sure, you can have a portable version of Sonic 1, but it's gonna be one of the worst experiences of all time. Hope that's okay. The game suffers from some of the worst slowdown and frame rate issues I've ever seen in a Sonic game. And considering we've got stuff like Sonic 06 and Sonic Boom on the roster, that's saying a lot. It's really bad, and I'm pretty sure it's what contributes to the physics feeling so off and why Sonic will just phase through things sometimes. But this game strikes one of my biggest pet peeves of all time for a Sonic game, which is having a low field of view. Because of the GBA's tiny resolution, the screen is so zoomed in that you can barely see a few feet in front of you. Like, imagine driving at 80 miles an hour in thick fog. It's not gonna go well. You'll be running into anything and everything, and combine that with a low frame rate, it makes almost everything unreactable unless you slow down to a snail's pace. And at that point, why are we even playing a Sonic game? Honestly, if you can even get through Green Hill Zone without wanting to yeet your GBA across the room, you're a stronger person than I could ever be. Now, Sonic 2 luckily doesn't have a botched GBA port like Sonic 1 does, but it has something arguably even worse. At least the GBA is a conventional video game system. The worst version of Sonic 2 is on, not a video game system, but a phone. Sonic 2 Dash and Sonic 2 Crash are a duo of games that attempted to port Sonic 2 to certain phones back in 2008. Created by a company called Rockpool, Sonic 2 Dash and Crash attempted to put Sonic 2 into Java, and it goes about as good as you'd expect. There are two versions of this duo of games, one for lower end devices and one for higher end. The higher end version honestly isn't all too bad. It's got the Sonic Advance style HUD and seems to play pretty close to the original for what it is, just with a weird vertical phone screen aspect ratio. But it's specifically the lower end versions of these games that we're interested in today. Yes, the children yearn for bad Sonic games. The lower end versions of Sonic 2 Dash and Sonic 2 Crash have very similar issues to Sonic 1 GBA. It has awful frame rate, terrible physics, and the screen is extremely zoomed in. Sure, you've got all this vertical space, but looking up at the beautiful sky can only help you so much from constantly running into everything that pops up in front of you. And that is if there's even a beautiful sky to look at. Some of these levels have flat out blank backgrounds. Yeah, did you know that null space from Sonic Forces actually first appeared in these games back in 2008? And while the high-end versions feature every level from Sonic 2, the low-end versions leave a handful of levels out. You're only able to play through Emerald Hill, Casino Night, Hilltop, Mystic Cave, Metropolis, and Death Egg zones. That means we're missing out on Chemical Plant, Aquatic Ruin, Oil Ocean, Sky Chase, and Wing Fortress Zone, unfortunately. There's also no special stages, and in turn, no Chaos Emeralds or Supersonic. This game doesn't even have boss fights at the end of the second zone. The only boss fight in the game is the Death Egg Robo. And, oh god, did they amputate his legs? What the hell, man? Now, even if your legs get amputated like the Death Egg Robo, it's all good. We don't need them where we're going. That's right, with the help of today's sponsor, Factor, you can get fresh, dietitian-approved meals delivered right to your doorstep. No prep, no mess, just delicious, healthy food in minutes. Whether you're looking to cut down on fast food or just want a more convenient way to eat healthy, Factor has got you covered. They even offer options for keto, calorie smart, and more. Specifically for me, Factor comes in clutch for my fitness-related needs. I've been hitting the gym extremely consistently, more so than I ever have before, and I'm super proud of myself for that. And for me, protein is always on my mind. With Factor, I can order specific high-protein meals in order to easily reach my protein goals, no cooking required. They even have these cold brew latte protein shakes that are absolutely delicious. I'm able to hit my protein goals without even thinking about it now, and I don't have to go grocery shopping, cook, or even make any dirty dishes. My favorite meals were the loaded bacon and shredded spinach meal and the Indian-style butter chicken meal. Toss them in the oven or microwave and you've got yourself a steaming hot meal within mere minutes. So if you're ready to eat healthier and save some time, head over to factor75.com or use the link in my description. And make sure to use code chaomix50 for 50% off your first box and 20% off your second month. That's code chaomix50 at factor75.com. Huge thank you to Factor for sponsoring today's video, and with all that being said, let's continue with today's episode. For Sonic CD, the worst version of this game is probably the PC version. And no, I'm not talking about the delisted Taxman port from 2012. I'm talking about the Windows 95 port. Now, to be quite honest, this port of Sonic CD isn't inherently bad like some of these other games we talked about, but very few know that there's actually two different versions, as explained by user Black Squirrel on this super interesting Sonic Retro thread. Basically, Sonic CD came out on PC twice in the 90s. First in 1995 and then again in 1996. The 1995 version was made in tandem with Intel to show that it could run games made for consoles like the Sega CD on a PC. But this version of Sonic CD wasn't sold in stores. Instead, it came pre-installed as a free bonus with certain new computers. The 1996 version was made using DirectX and distributed through CD-ROMs. You know, like when PC games used to use actual discs. More or less, both versions are very similar apart from a few menu and font changes as well as some slight encoding differences in the intro animations. The one big difference is that the 1995 version is capped at 30 FPS. And it's literally for this one reason that marks this as the worst version in my eyes. It isn't overly zoomed in, it doesn't suffer from frame rate issues or wonky physics, it just runs at 30 frames per second. And in a world where every other version runs at 60, this one just can't compete. It also doesn't help that this version is probably one of the most inaccessible versions out there since it came bundled with very specific computers from like 30 years ago. Though if it weren't for this version, I would have to give a pretty hot take and say it's the original Sega CD version. Like, it couldn't even properly render the animated intro and credits scene that Studio Junio painstakingly created for this game. Anyways, the worst version of Sonic 3 and Knuckles is... What the heck is that sound? Oh god, make it stop. Yeah, this is the PC CD-ROM version of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, the Sonic and Knuckles collection. And as you can, hear, it uses the stock Windows MIDI sound font for all of its music. Now, let me just say, if you grew up with this version, I'm sorry, but are you okay? I have no idea how you survived this audio massacre. The original soundtrack, composed by a team of absolute legends, and rumored to involve Michael Jackson, is one of the best soundtracks in all of video games. But on top of the sound fonts sounding like absolute garbage, a lot of the music is replaced with completely different tracks. This is likely due to the legal issues with the Jackson estate. The same thing happened in Sonic Origins. But it's not just the music that's a problem. This version has compatibility issues on modern PCs, making it almost impossible to play unless you're running a virtual machine or just straight up using an ancient-ass computer. The frame rate can also be choppy in certain areas, but that's really the least of our concerns right now. Seriously, the Windows MIDI sound font alone makes this version of Sonic 3 and Knuckles a borderline war crime. If you value your ears, stick to the original or any of the other re-releases. Sonic Adventure 1 is an interesting entry. We've got the original Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast and its port on the GameCube's Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut. DX does add quite a lot. It bumps the game up from 30 to 60 FPS, adds 60 new missions, has a playable Metal Sonic, has higher poly player models, unlockable Game Gear titles, and a completely revamped Chao Garden. You'd think that it'd be a no-brainer that this is the better version, but you'd actually be surprised in how many ways this port botches certain things from the original. For example, the lighting is an overall massive downgrade. What were once extremely atmospheric environments are now almost completely unlit. The new models, while nice, have awful materials that make them look like they were smothered in olive oil. Most of the textures were changed for pretty much no reason, leading to certain areas having different vibes, and there's a ton of new glitches that didn't exist in the original. Now, even at this point, I'd say the better version may be arguable. normal, depending on your preferences. That is, until we introduced the PC CD-ROM version of Sonic Adventure DX. Yeah, we've got another one of those. This is a port of a port, and as you can guess, even more things get lost in translation. Like usual, it has pretty bad compatibility on modern PCs, and I'm almost positive it has zero controller support. I used to have this version of the game, and I can't remember a single time I was able to get a controller working with this thing. Keyboard controls were luckily never too bad for the PC versions of Sonic CD and Sonic 3, but trying to play a high-speed 3D platformer on a keyboard, it just shouldn't be done. But hey, this makes the decision easy at least. This version just sucks objectively. It's so bad. Sonic Adventure 2 also came out on PC, but luckily with a more modern release on Steam. No CD-ROM this time, we're so back. This version is awesome, right? I mean, I have over 100 hours of playtime on Steam. I went through and got all the A ranks on every level. I spent a good amount of time raising my son in the Chow Garden. But then you start to remember, oh yeah, I have like 20 mods keeping this game on life support, don't I? What the heck was the vanilla game like again? Ooh, yeah, never mind, fuck this game. The Steam version of Sonic Adventure 2 is like a port of a port of a port. The game originally launched on Dreamcast, then got ported to GameCube as Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, then eventually landed on HD consoles like PS3 and Xbox 360. By the time it arrived on Steam, it was like playing a game created through a game of telephone, and it shows. The game relies on this ancient clunky launcher that I swear to God just straight up refuses to recognize your controller most of the time. Oh, and let's not forget the random crashes on startup. Sure, when you load it up modded to the gills, it's fantastic. Restoring the Dreamcast shaders, fixing bugs, adding in HD textures, and so on. But without mods, vanilla Sonic Adventure 2 on Steam is a different story that I wouldn't wish even on my worst enemy to play. Sonic Heroes was a major turning point in the series. It was the first true multi-platform Sonic game, and it was kind of a big deal. Released on the GameCube, PS2, Xbox, and even PC via CD-ROM, this game was supposed to be a universal experience, giving fans across all platforms the same fast-paced action they knew and loved. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, of course, the worst version of this has to be the PC CD-ROM one. But would you believe me if I told you that the PS2 version is by far the worst? Let me explain. First off, the frame rate. The PS2 version seems to be the only version of this game locked at 30 frames per second. It's a significant downgrade compared to the smoother experience on the GameCube, Xbox, and even PC, which are all a pretty consistent 60 FPS. But even worse, the PS2 version doesn't even consistently hit this 30 FPS. But the frame rate issues are just the beginning. There's also the visual pop-in. In the PS2 version, objects and textures appear out of nowhere, giving the game an unfinished, janky vibe. And don't even get me started on the load times. You finish a stage, get hyped for the next level, and then bam, hit with a loading screen that feels like you could have made and eaten an entire sandwich. Sonic 06 is pretty much bad no matter what console you play it on, but it's especially bad on the PS3, and it all comes down to performance. Although the PS3 was the more powerful console compared to the Xbox 360, it was extremely hard to develop and optimize for according to many developers from the time. This led to a lot of multi-platform games performing worse unfortunately, and Sonic 06 was an apparent one given how already bad it performed in general. The biggest issue is the slowdown. This game is interesting because instead of frame skipping, which has the game skip frames and looks choppy in order to keep up, it'll just slow down the entire game to compensate. So while the game is still technically hitting 60 FPS, the game can slow down to like half the speed. The PS3 has worse slowdown than the 360 version. Some people even say the glitches are worse on the PS3 version, but I feel that that's a bit anecdotal. The glitches are bad on every version. The moral of the story is just don't play this game. Similar to Sonic 06, Sonic Unleashed released on both PS3 and Xbox 360. And between the two, I'd have to say again, the PS3 version is much worse due to performance. Interestingly, the PS3 version targets 60 FPS, while the Xbox 360 version targets 30 FPS. You'd think this is a huge plus for the PS3 version, but not really, because it hardly ever reaches this 60 FPS target and it's much more unstable. While the 360 version is capped at 30, it's much more consistent at hitting this target. I swear, the PS3 version will sometimes dip into the single digits for frame rate. It's awful for such a fast-paced game. Now, Unleashed does have a Wii and PS2 version created by Dimps, the guys who did the Sonic Advance games. I don't want to say these versions are inherently worse than their HD counterparts though, because at the end of the day, these are pretty different games. They have different level layouts, gameplay mechanics, objectives, etc. So it's probably only fair to compare the SD versions to themselves, and when it comes to these versions, the PS2 is by far the worst. Listen, we're comparing the PS2 to the Wii. The PS2 was already underpowered compared to the GameCube, so it's easy to see how the PS2 version of Unleashed would suffer with performance. There is one more version of Sonic Unleashed I'd like to talk about though. In 2009, a Java version of Sonic Unleashed was created by Gameloft for mobile phones. It's a somewhat janky 2D platformer featuring boost and even werehog gameplay. It includes the levels Chunnan, Apatos, Rooftop Run, and Mazuri. It even has boss fights. For what it is, it's honestly pretty cool despite how janky it can be. But if you consider this a version of Sonic Unleashed, I'd probably say it's the worst one. Sonic 4 Episode 1 started development as a mobile game, and even in the final HD console releases, I feel like its mobile game origins can be felt in the gameplay and graphics. This game did still get released on a ton of devices though, including tablets and phones. And surprisingly, the quality is actually decently consistent across all versions of this game. Obviously, the console versions are going to be a bit better with slightly improved visuals, so technically these are the best ways to play this game. Which means the worst version would have to be one of the mobile device versions. But which one? Well, the quote-unquote worst version of this game also happens to be one of the more interesting releases. On pretty much any phone that wasn't Android, so iPhone and Windows phones, yeah, remember when Microsoft used to make phones? Sonic looked a bit different. These versions of the game feature Sonic using the Sonic Rush model. Okay, I'm sorry, but this is awesome. Sure, it's low poly, making it lower fidelity than the other ones, but like, I love this guy. I feel like it's kind of unfair to call this the worst version, but at the same time, it is kind of cursed to see the Rush model in Sonic 4. Sonic 4 Episode 2 is a pretty similar story. It was developed for both console and mobile devices, but there's one port here that I think automatically makes it the worst version. So, do you guys remember the Ouya? Yeah, I didn't think so. The Ouya was a failed attempt at an Android-based home console. It was released in 2013 and its services ended in 2019. But even when its services were live, its most popular game at the time only sold 7,000 copies. The Ouya was a complete commercial disaster, and Sonic 4 Episode 2 actually released on this thing. I'm sure the game ran fine, but like, it was on the Ouya and died along with it. And that's really the only reason I'm considering this the worst version. And I guess the Ouya controller and user interface kind of sucks, so that just makes it all the more cumbersome to play. Sonic Colors released on both the Wii and DS in 2010. Now, you might be thinking, oh, obviously the DS version has to be the worst one, right? Well, actually, not at all. Colors DS is essentially the third Sonic Rush-style game, and it's pretty different from its Wii counterpart. It really isn't similar enough to directly compare, and for what it is, it's actually a really solid game. So now what? Well, the console version of Colors would get a remaster in 2021, and I'm being very generous even using that word. This remaster was a complete botch of the original in terms of graphics and performance. Its lighting is all wrong, and especially if you're playing it on the Nintendo Switch, the game is locked at 30 frames per second and can dip under quite frequently. This is the worst version of this game. Like, even the Wii played this game better. On top of that, before it got patched, the game used to be riddled with glitches not found in the original, some of them being straight up seizure-inducing. Sonic Generations was also a multi-plat release, coming out on PS3, 360, PC, and 3DS. And I'm not even going to sugarcoat it, the 3DS version of Generations isn't all that amazing. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not bad, especially considering what they tried to do on the 3DS hardware. And once again, it's worth noting the 3DS version isn't a direct port, it's kind of its own thing. The game still features the classic modern Sonic gameplay split, the stages are based on iconic Sonic levels from across the series, and the controls are serviceable for a handheld Sonic title. But the roster of levels is completely different. This isn't a bad thing or anything, I think it's actually pretty awesome. It really just comes down to the fact that this isn't as fun as the HD release. It has completely 2D level design and doesn't feel as polished as the console release. So while the 3DS version isn't a complete disaster like some of these other games, it's hard to praise it too much when you're literally comparing it to one of the best Sonic games of all time. Unfortunately, it's just a matter of the bar being set too high by the HD release. Just like Generations, Lost World has releases on console, PC, and handheld. And trust me, the worst version of Sonic Lost World isn't even up for debate. It's the 3DS version. Once again, this isn't a direct port of Lost World to a lower fidelity system. It's another reimagining, just like Generations 3DS was. It shares the same level themes and very loose gameplay ideas, but at the end of the day, this is its own game. That's fun in itself, but this is just another case of it not being as fun as the console release. Now, unlike Generations, I really don't think the HD version of Lost World is even that great to begin with, so I think this version could have had the opportunity to be the better version. But as expected from games like these, it's pretty much a watered-down version of the original, having more awkward controls and worse level design. I'm sorry, but this version didn't even stand a chance. Okay. So you know Netflix? Yes, I promise this is relevant. Well, Netflix Games launched in 2021 as part of Netflix's efforts to span beyond streaming movies and TV shows, offering a small library of mobile games accessible through its app for subscribers. Now, you're probably thinking, what the heck, is this like a sponsor segment? But no, Sonic Mania actually had a release on Netflix Games. And would you guess it? This is the worst way to play it. It comes down to mostly two things: botched audio and atrocious menu design. Sonic Mania has one of the best soundtracks in the entire franchise, but for whatever reason, the audio compression is so bad it sounds like you're listening to the soundtrack through a telephone call. Hey, maybe they were just going for accuracy since this is a phone port. But what's worse is the menu design. This was just not tested at all, I'm almost positive. Instead of using like regular touchscreen controls, you have to use these small buttons that are like almost impossible to press because they're so tiny. Navigating the menu is honestly more challenging than some of this game. Also, the in-game touchscreen controls just kinda suck. But that's just a general complaint I have for most mobile games. Sonic Mania on Netflix is truly the port nobody asked for. Now, for this next one, I'm gonna lump all three of these games together because they have the same answer and issues. But for Sonic Forces, Frontiers, and Superstars, I wish I could say that they had some kind of crazy obscure port that completely sucked. But they really just don't. The worst they all have going for them is that they released on the Switch. You've got the usual issues, like Forces and Frontiers being capped at 30 FPS, and all three games having frame drops, lower resolution, and worse graphics and lighting. But at the end of the day, these aren't terrible ways to play any of these games. Yes, they're objectively worse, but man, I think this really just goes to show that gaming has come a long way. No longer do we need completely separate remakes of games for portable consoles. Our portable consoles these days, while still admittedly are noticeably weaker, can more or less play a lot of the same games as the big boy consoles. Sure, you're gonna have to compromise, but if you would have told 10-year-old me that you'd be able to play a fully 3D Sonic game on a handheld system, I wouldn't have believed you. Don't get me wrong, all of the Switch versions of these games have pretty glaring issues that their higher fidelity counterparts don't have. But I really think this gap is only going to get smaller and smaller as video game consoles progress. And there you have it, the worst way to play every mainline Sonic game. It's clear that Sonic has been through the ringer for certain ports or versions of his games. While some of these games can still be fun despite their flaws, others feel like pure masochism. But hey, that's the roller coaster ride of being a Sonic fan, right? If anything, these terrible versions make us appreciate the good ones even more. Except for Sonic 1 GBA, that game can burn in hell.